Jack. How are you?
Excellent. It's an honor to have you. It's a pleasure. All right, everybody, the senator is going to speak. His message is going to blow you away. It's an honor, like I mentioned before, to me and to our group to have a man of this type of standing to come speak before us. Anyway, please give a round of applause.
I want to thank you for what you do. I want to thank you for being involved in the Tea Party. I want to thank you for reminding Americans and Republicans what this country means, our roots, where we came from, what we should stand for, that this is a government that's supposed to be a limited government. Because all too often, I think, the folks in Washington, D.C. forget that. I had the great privilege of serving you in the United States Senate for 16 months. I was the first United States Senator from Broward County. This is my home. I was born in Fort Lauderdale. My grandfather came to Fort Lauderdale in 1951 in a 1949 Pontiac with 5 screaming kids in the back. Came down here, didn't know anyone, didn't have a job. But he was in the trades. He did a construction, a carpenter, and he worked for someone else. It was LeMieux Construction eventually. He started his own company. Until recently, when my dad retired, it was the longest continuously run construction company in Broward County. My dad went to Fort Lauderdale High School with this young lady over here, Senator Debbie Sanderson. He worked out in the hot Florida sun, and his only ambition for his son, his only child, was I would one day not have to work outside and I could work in the air conditioner. And I've achieved that goal. But Mom and Dad didn't go to college, but they worked hard, small business folks. You know, when you grow up in a family that's a small business family, my mom worked for my dad, and then they had some carpenters that worked for them. You can't help but be a Republican. Because small business people realize that you only can spend as much money as you take in. And that every tax, every regulation, everything that the government makes you do that makes life more difficult just ends up costing money and keeping you from succeeding in life and keeping you from hiring more people. But they focused on my education. My wife Mikey and I grew up here in Broward County. She moved here when she was 3. We grew up in Coral Springs, went to public schools all the way through. We didn't meet again until our high school reunion. Now, if she were here, she would tell you if I would have asked her out in high school, that we could have cut 10 years out of that. We would have been together sooner. I'm here to tell you she would never have gone out with me. She was way too cute and way too popular. But we made our home here in Fort Lauderdale until I had the chance to do some public service. Now, I was involved, as you know, with the Republican Party here. I was the chairman of the Republican Party here in Broward County from 2000 to 2002. Then I was asked, thank you ma'am, then I was asked to go to Tallahassee to be the Deputy Attorney General. Charlie Crist asked me to go be the #2 person in the AG's office. And I thought I'd do that for a couple of years and then come home to Fort Lauderdale. Because it was a real honor to be the #2 law enforcement officer in the state of Florida. We got to prosecute cases and took a case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, a death penalty case. But something happened on the way to the fair and I ended up being in Tallahassee for 5.5 years. You know I was Charlie Crist's chief of staff for the first year he was governor. And then I was back in private practice, in private life, when Senator Martinez decided to resign. When he resigned, there was a search. I didn't think I would get picked. I was honored that I did. And I went to Washington in September of 2009. September 2009. September 10th of 2009. The day I was sworn in. I served you for 16 months. It was the privilege of my life. But I want to tell you, as much of a privilege as it was, I've never been associated with a more dysfunctional institution than the United States. Washington, D.C. is bizarre, and it is broken. Corrupt. And it is corrupt in many ways. And it's worse than you know. And you know more than most people do. Because you're paying attention, you're focused, you're keeping us back to our values that made this country great. But I want to tell you, The way this government misspends your money is outrageous. And it's like a bizarro world. When I first got there, I'm from, run a business here, help run a law firm here in Florida. We can only spend as much as we take in.
Right.
Like your businesses, like your families. Even in state government. Now that's not pretty either, but at least they can only spend as much as they take in. They're going to cut $3.5 billion out of the budget this year because they can't spend more than they take in. We've got a balanced budget amendment in Florida.
Yeah.
In Washington, D.C., there's no such thing. They don't even look at how much they take in when they decide how much they're going to spend. They call it a budget. It's not a budget if you don't look at what you take in. They just take what they spent last year and they add to it. And they don't even know what they're spending the money on. I'm not kidding. These agencies have been around and they are spending priorities and policies and bills and laws from the 60s, 70s, 80s without any evaluation as to one, whether those were good to start with, two, whether they're still good, three, whether or not they're being done efficiently and effectively. Congress doesn't do oversight. They don't bring these agency heads in, these cabinet secretaries, and say, Madam Secretary, tell me about your budget, tell me whether these programs work, tell me whether or not we should get rid of them, and whether or not you've got metrics in place to evaluate whether they're good or bad. They don't do that. These agency heads, they're there for 18 months on average. They call them in Washington the summer help. So this is what it is. It's a snowball, and it's rolling downhill on its own energy. And it gathers and gathers and gets bigger and bigger, and it's out of control. And these people in Congress walk around and whistle through the graveyard like nothing is wrong. And it's not just the Democrats. Most of the Republicans don't get it either. Now it's getting better because we elected a whole new crop of people like Alan West and Marco Rubio. I can still tell you there's not enough of them. And I can tell you why. And here's a perfect example. They're talking now about cutting $60 to $70 to $100 billion out of the budget. That is around the fringes. This budget this year is $1.6 trillion in debt. $1.6 trillion deficit. That means we are spending $1.6 trillion more than we're taking in. Okay? How much is $1 trillion? It's 1,000 billion. 1,000 billion. It's a million. I'm sorry. It's a million billion. So here, let's put it in these numbers, these aliens, and the joke in Washington is don't tell Obama what comes after trillion. Right? let me put it in a way that I think is easier to understand. If you take $1 bills and lay them on this floor and carpeted the floor, $1 million in $1 bills covers 2 football fields. Okay, you can picture that in your mind. It's 1,000. $1 billion in $1 bills carpeted on the ground covers Key West, Florida. 3.4 square miles, Joe, covered. Think of Duval Street with $1 bills going down the street. Stranger things have happened in Key West.
Most of them on
I sound like you know. $1 trillion covers Rhode Island twice. This is an enormous amount of money. So we're going $1.6 trillion in deficit this year. We've gone up $3 trillion in deficit in the last 2 years, $5 trillion in the last 4. My friends, it took this country 200 years to go $1 trillion in debt around 1980, and we're going more than $1 trillion in debt a year.
Boo!
It's amazing.
It's terrible.
So when they talk about cutting $100 billion, we're going $5 billion in debt a day. You're talking about 20 days worth. This is like bailing out the sinking ship with a thimble.
That's not even counting the interest.
It's not even counting the interest. So we've got to do something a lot more significant than that. Now why do we have to do something, and why do we have to do it now? Well, what's going to happen in Washington is we're like that family who is trying to make their credit card payment. And it's getting out of control. And then there's a month where they can't make their minimum payment. and then the credit card company or the bank cancels their card. That day's coming. That day is coming. We've been talking about debt for a long time, but there's a point when you have to pay. So right now we spend $200 billion a year making the interest payment. $200 billion. Our state budget, by the way, is $66.5 this year. $200 billion on interest on programs we shouldn't have paid for in the past. By the end of the decade, it'll be $900 billion. We can't make a $900 billion payment. Next year it's $260. So sometime between 2012 and 2020, the government's going to go broke. The government will not be able to make its interest payment. We're not talking just about my 4 kids or your grandkids. You always hear politicians say that. We got to stop spending for our children's future. That's true. But it's not going to wait for Max, Taylor, Chase, and Madeline, my 4 kids. It's going to happen now. Sometime before that day, when we can't make our payment, the world financial markets are going to figure out that we can't make our payment. And you saw what happened in Greece. Did you see last weekend in London when they were protesting in the street and breaking the windows in stores? This is serious. This is the greatest threat to our country, internal threat to our country, since the Civil War. We had Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in front of the Armed Services Committee, where I serve, testify. And he was asked, what's the most extreme threat facing America? He didn't say Iran. He didn't say North Korea. He didn't say Al-Qaeda. He didn't say China. He said the debt. So I have a plan to fix this. A lot of people tell you we need to make cuts. They don't have a plan to do it. By the way, balanced budget amendment. I offered one. Everyone does. It's the right thing to do. But that's easy talk. It's easy talk. It takes 2/3 of the House and Senate to get it done. So people say, oh, I offered a balanced budget amendment, and then they go right on spending, right on earmarks. By the way, I didn't do any earmarks. Not one.
Thank you.
At best, those earmarks are the engine that drive the spending train. Because if you get a project in a proposal, in a budget item, and then that budget's 20% more than last year, you can't vote against it. Because your project will go down. It's the gateway drug. At worst, they're corruption. Because someone wants that project and you know they're going to give you money if you vote for it in your campaign. I never did an earmark. But here's the proposal I have. Let's go back to 2007 level spending for the federal government. And I don't just mean discretionary. You hear Speaker of the House Boehner, and I have respect for him. He's talking about going back to 2008 level discretionary spending. Discretionary spending is 15% of the budget. You do defense, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, that's 85% of the budget. I say cap everything at 2007 levels. All entitlements, all spending. Now this is 3.5 years ago, my friends. This is not 1930. It's not 1950. It's not 1980. Can we not live off of what we took in 3.5 years ago? If we capped all spending at that level, it would do 2 things. It would make Congress do its job. They'd have to prioritize. They'd have to do what Senator Sanderson did when she was in the state legislature, what Commissioner LaMarca has to do here in Broward County. They'd have to look and see whether or not these proposals were good or bad, working or not, get rid of the ones that weren't. So they'll do their job. The second thing is if you cap total spending at 2007 levels for the next 10 years, by 2013, 2 years from now, you balance the budget. By 2020, instead of having a $26 trillion debt with a $900 billion interest payment, you cut the current debt of 14.5 to 7, and you save America. These are trying times. We need people who are going to go to Washington with the courage of their convictions to do what is right, and guess what? You know what they should do after that? They should come home. So I am as worried about this as I've ever been worried about anything. But we can fix it. It is not America that's broken. It is the government that's broken. Go back and read, if you haven't read it recently, go back and read Reagan's first inaugural address in January of 1981. It sounds like he's speaking to us today. It sounds like he's speaking to us today. But we can fix these problems. I want you to believe, as I know you do, in the ability of Americans to rise to any challenge. Every generation, Americans have come forward and done what they needed to do to fight either an external enemy or solve an internal problem. There's nothing we as Americans cannot do. We fought Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany at the same time, and we beat both of them. We landed on the moon. We're curing cancer. We are mapping the very fabric of life in the human genome. And in our spare bedrooms and garages and even now dorm rooms, Americans are inventing the greatest inventions in the world and creating the world's greatest companies and employing millions of people who can then pursue their dreams. We are, as Reagan said, that shining city on the hill. We are, as Lincoln said, that last best hope for man. We are that nation upon which God shed His grace. So I am so thankful for you, what you stand for, what you do, that you hold people accountable, that you bring these issues forward. We would not be where we are today without you. We will not solve our problems unless you continue to fight. Thank you for letting me be here.